The night glittered with golden chandeliers and expensive champagne as the guests mingled inside the grand ballroom. Everyone had come dressed in their finest gowns and tuxedos, eager to impress, eager to be noticed, for this was not just any party. It was a celebration thrown by Victor Harrington, a man whose wealth and arrogance were whispered about in the corridors of high society. Victor was a millionaire, ruthless in business and even more ruthless in his personal life. He walked through the crowd with the air of a man who owned everything he saw, his arm draped casually around a woman who was not his wife. The woman was younger, stunning, with a sharp laugh that echoed too loudly and eyes that sparkled only when they reflected Victor's fortune. People pretended not to stare, but their curiosity betrayed them. At the far end of the hall, a woman stood quietly, hands resting protectively on the swell of her stomach. Elena, Victor's wife, was radiant even in her silence. Her beauty was gentle, her presence calm, yet that night she seemed like a shadow fading into the corner of her own story. Her heart pounded, not just from the weight of pregnancy, but from the storm brewing inside her. She had heard rumors of Victor's infidelity before, but tonight was different. Tonight, he didn't care to hide. Tonight, he humiliated her in front of the very world she once shared with him. Elena had married Victor 5 years earlier, when he was already wealthy but not yet untouchable. Back then, he was charming, attentive, a man who seemed to sweep her into a fairy tale. She had believed in love, in the promises he whispered late at night when no one else was listening. She believed him when he said she was the only woman he could ever truly love. But time had revealed his true nature. Money had corrupted him further, turning that charm into cruelty and those promises into empty lies. He no longer looked at her with tenderness. He looked at her as if she were a burden, as if the child growing inside her was an inconvenience to his lavish lifestyle. The room roared with laughter and clinking glasses, but Elena's world grew quiet, painfully quiet, as she watched her husband lean down to whisper something into his mistress's ear. The woman giggled and brushed her fingers across his chest, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Victor kissed her. Right there, in front of everyone, in front of Elena. Gasps erupted among the crowd. Some turned away out of politeness, others out of guilt for enjoying the spectacle. But everyone saw. Elena felt her throat tighten, tears threatening to fall, but she swallowed them back. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She began to move forward, her steps slow but steady, until she stood before him. The music had dimmed and conversations faltered. All eyes were on the scene unfolding in the center of the room. Victor looked at her with disdain, as though her presence were an interruption to his pleasure. "What are you doing here?" he asked coldly, as if she had no right to stand beside him, as if she were an uninvited guest at her own husband's party. Elena's voice trembled but held strength. "I came because I am your wife, Victor. Because I believe tonight was supposed to be a celebration for both of us, not a spectacle of your betrayal." His mistress smirked, clutching his arm tighter. As though staking her claim, Victor chuckled bitterly, his voice carrying enough venom to cut her down in front of everyone.
"You, my wife, look at yourself, Elena!"
"You've become pathetic, weak, always clinging to your condition as if carrying my child makes you special. You're nothing compared to her." He gestured at his mistress. The words sliced through her like glass, but before she could respond, Victor stepped closer. His eyes burned with arrogance and rage. And then it happened. He raised his hand and struck her across the face. The sound echoed through the ballroom like thunder, silencing every whisper, every breath. Elena stumbled, clutching her cheek, but she did not fall. The room was frozen. Guests stared in disbelief, some horrified, others secretly thrilled by the drama, but none dared to intervene. Victor smirked, satisfied by the display of his dominance. "Now," he said coldly, "leave. You no longer belong in my world." The words rang in her ears, but instead of collapsing, Elena straightened her spine. Her eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, burned with a quiet fire. She turned without another word and walked out of the ballroom, her dignity intact, though her heart was shattered. As the heavy doors closed behind her, Victor laughed and raised his glass, as though nothing had happened, as though humiliating his pregnant wife in public was just another amusement. But what he did not know was that Elena's departure was not the end of the story. It was the beginning, because karma had been waiting for this moment, and soon Victor would face consequences he could never have imagined. Outside in the cold night air, Elena's breath came in shaky bursts. Her cheek still stung, her heart still ached, but amidst the pain, something inside her shifted. She realized she had been living in a prison built of wealth and lies. She realized she had given her soul to a man who never deserved it. And now, she had to think not only of herself, but of the child she carried. She could not allow her baby to grow up in the shadow of Victor's cruelty. She could not allow her life to be defined by his arrogance. So she made a decision, a quiet, fierce decision that would change everything. The night after the humiliating incident spread like wildfire across the elite circles of the city. People whispered behind champagne glasses and in hushed tones over lavish dinners. A millionaire's scandal was always gossip fuel, but what made this one different was the woman at the center of it all, his pregnant wife, Evelyn. While the world saw a fragile woman publicly disgraced, humiliated by the man who had vowed to protect her, Evelyn was quietly writing a story of her own. She was not the kind of woman to weep in silence forever, and though her heart had been shattered by his betrayal, a fire had begun to smolder within her. She knew that life had handed her an unbearable wound, but wounds often carried lessons, and Evelyn was ready to transform her pain into something that no one, not even her husband, could strip away. Meanwhile, Daniel, the millionaire, strutted around believing he had silenced her. His mistress, Veronica, thrived on the attention she was suddenly gaining. She draped herself on his arm in expensive restaurants, thinking she had won. People bowed before Daniel, but behind closed doors, the cracks in his empire had already begun to show. Deals were falling apart, his rivals were circling like sharks sensing blood, and more importantly, the very public humiliation of Evelyn had painted him as a ruthless man without loyalty. Investors questioned his stability, board members whispered about votes, and Daniel's pride blinded him to the storm that was fast approaching. He dismissed it all, never realizing that his greatest downfall would not come from his enemies. It would come from the very woman he had wronged. But Evelyn wasn't ready to reveal her hand. She continued to live quietly, avoiding the public eye, keeping her pregnancy safe. Friends pitied her, neighbors whispered about her disappearance from social events, but Evelyn was planning something far beyond anyone's imagination. She had found comfort in an old family friend, an elderly lawyer named Martin, who had once promised her late father that he would always protect her. Evelyn went to him not to seek revenge, but to seek guidance. Martin, wise and patient, told her stories of women in history who had been wronged and rose stronger than ever. He reminded her that strength did not always come from rage, but from patience, intelligence, and timing. As Evelyn listened, she began to weave her own silent plan, understanding that karma had its way of balancing life, but sometimes it needed a gentle push. And so Evelyn bided her time. She wrote letters late at night, letters that spoke not only of her pain but of her clarity. In them, she revealed truths Daniel had hidden, truths about his financial corruption, shady dealings, and even secrets about Veronica that could topple them both in an instant. She didn't write them for him. She wrote them for the world, to be released only when the time was right. To outsiders, it seemed Evelyn had been silenced, but in truth, she was becoming the quiet storm preparing to strike. Daniel, on the other hand, laughed at the rumors that Evelyn might leave him. He mocked her in private, telling Veronica that she was too weak, too dependent, and too broken to ever fight back. Veronica encouraged his arrogance, whispering poison into his ear, assuring him that Evelyn would fade into the background, forgotten like yesterday's news. But fate has its way of humbling even the proudest men, and Daniel's reckoning was drawing near. Because on the day of his biggest business celebration, when the entire city's elite gathered to honor him, Evelyn finally walked into the room. The hush that fell was deafening. The woman who had been humiliated, the woman everyone thought destroyed, stood tall, radiant in a simple but elegant dress, her pregnancy showing proudly, her eyes steady and unflinching. She carried not just herself that night, but the dignity of every woman who had ever been wronged and underestimated. Daniel's smirk faltered when he saw her, and Veronica's grip on his arm tightened nervously. The whispers grew into roars as Evelyn walked past them, each step echoing louder than applause. louder than Daniel's shallow words of power. People watch, waiting for her collapse, but instead Evelyn reached the stage, and with a calmness that silenced the room, she began to speak. Her voice didn't shake, her tears didn't fall, and her words were sharper than any slap Daniel had given her in public. She told the truth, not with anger, but with grace. She revealed what kind of man Daniel truly was, not just to her but to his business, his partners, and the very people who worshipped him. And as she spoke, Daniel felt the walls closing in. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. For the first time, he realized that his greatest mistake wasn't humiliating Evelyn in public. It was underestimating her strength to rise again. By the end of her speech, the applause was thunderous, not for Daniel but for Evelyn. Cameras flashed, investors exchanged wary looks, and Daniel stood frozen as the empire he had built on pride and cruelty began to crumble before his eyes. And Evelyn, with her child safe within her, walked off that stage not as a victim but as a victor, leaving behind the man who once thought she was powerless. The moment Evelyn stepped off that stage, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted forever. It was as though the power that Daniel once held over the room had been stripped away in a single stroke of her voice. People no longer looked at him with admiration, they looked at him with unease, with suspicion, with pity even. His name, once gilded with prestige, now hung in the air like a stain no one wanted to touch. Veronica, still clutching his arm, tried to smile, but her face betrayed a flicker of fear. Because she too understood what had just happened. She had attached herself to a man she believed to be untouchable, but Evelyn's calm and powerful exposure of him had revealed he was nothing more than a man standing on crumbling ground. Daniel, still arrogant in his denial, stormed to the stage after Evelyn left, attempting to laugh off as a bitter rant from a scorned wife. He raised his glass and mocked her in front of the guests, claiming her words were nothing but jealousy and delusion. Yet the more he spoke, the more hollow his voice sounded. Investors whispered among themselves, reporters scribbled notes, and even his closest allies looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes. He failed to see that no matter how many times he tried to polish his mask, the cracks Evelyn revealed had already taken root in people's minds. He thought the night could still be salvaged, but karma doesn't wait for permission. It strikes the moment arrogance blinds a man. That very evening, while Daniel was trying to drown his humiliation in expensive whiskey, news began to circulate on social media. A video of Evelyn's speech had already gone viral, spreading faster than any publicist could contain. Millions watched the pregnant woman standing strong in front of her husband and his mistress, calling out his cruelty and revealing his corruption with dignity rather than malice. The world didn't just sympathize with her, they rallied behind her. Comments flooded in from people across the globe, strangers who felt her pain, strangers who admired her courage. In a matter of hours, Evelyn became a symbol of resilience, while Daniel was painted as a tyrant who preyed on weakness. The fallout came quickly. Calls from investors were no longer congratulatory, they were demands for explanations. Board members called emergency meetings. Deals that had once been solid began to dissolve, and powerful partners withdrew their trust. And as Daniel's professional world began to unravel, so too did his personal life. Veronica, who had once been so smug at his side, now found herself questioned by reporters, cornered by whispers of her own scandals, and exposed as nothing more than a shallow opportunist. She began to feel the cold sting of isolation, and though she tried to cling to Daniel, the man she had chosen as her ticket to wealth, she realized that being associated with him now meant sharing in his ruin. Meanwhile, Evelyn did not celebrate or gloat. She stayed home quietly, surrounded by a small circle of loyal friends and the warmth of the child growing inside her. Her lawyer, Martin, guided her through every step, advising her on how to handle the sudden media attention and the flood of support. Evelyn spoke only once after the viral speech, giving a calm interview where she refused to insult Daniel further. Instead, she said simply, "I believe in truth. I believe that every action has a consequence. I spoke not to destroy a man, but to protect my child and to remind myself that silence in the face of cruelty is its own form of surrender." Her words resonated far deeper than any revenge could, and in that moment she became untouchable, not because of power or money, but because of integrity. But Daniel's descent into ruin was far from over. Days after the viral scandal, government investigators announced an inquiry into his financial dealings. Papers were leaked, accounts were frozen, and allies who once praised him now abandoned him to save themselves. For the first time, Daniel experienced the loneliness he had so often inflicted on others. Veronica left quietly one morning, disappearing without a warning, taking with her whatever she could, jewels, money, possessions, but leaving behind a note that read, "You're no longer useful to me." Those words stung worse than Evelyn's speech, because they reflected the very cruelty he had once lived by. Betrayal, it seemed, had finally circled back to him. At his lowest, Daniel tried to contact Evelyn, calling her repeatedly, sending desperate messages begging for forgiveness. He promised to change. He pleaded for a chance to be a father to their unborn child, but Evelyn remained silent. She wasn't cruel, but she was resolute. She knew that forgiveness wasn't owed, and some wounds couldn't be healed with empty apologies. Each unanswered call became another reminder to Daniel that he had destroyed not just a marriage, but the one person who had ever truly loved him for who he was, not for his money, not for his power, but for his heart. The public watched his downfall like a live performance of justice. The man who had once stood tall above everyone else was now a symbol of arrogance, destroyed by truth. Evelyn, meanwhile, grew stronger each day, preparing for the arrival of her baby. Her strength wasn't born out of revenge, it was born out of survival, out of the knowledge that dignity, once defended, becomes a shield no cruelty can pierce. She had walked through the fire, and while Daniel was left scorched and broken, she had emerged like steel, unyielding and unbroken. And so, while Daniel's empire collapsed piece by piece, Evelyn built her own quiet world, filled with hope and peace. Friends who once pitied her now admired her. Strangers who once whispered about her now defended her fiercely. And though she never sought it, she had become something rare, a living testament that even in the darkest betrayal, one could rise not by destroying others, but by standing firmly in truth and letting karma do the rest. The night Evelyn finally gave birth, the city seemed quieter, as though it too held its breath for her. In a modest hospital room, surrounded by a few trusted friends and a nurse who spoke to her gently, she welcomed into the world a baby boy whose first cry pierced through every shadow that had haunted her. Tears streamed down her face as she held him, his tiny fists clutching her finger, as though promising he would never let go. For Evelyn, this child was not just a new life. He was proof that from pain could come beauty, from betrayal could come renewal, from endings could come beginnings. She whispered softly into his ear, promising him love, promising him safety, promising him a life built not on lies and greed, but on truth and compassion. On the very same night, Daniel sat alone in his once grand mansion, staring at the walls that now seemed to close in on him. The phone on his desk was silent, the halls were empty. The echo of laughter, of guests, of parties had been replaced with a suffocating silence. His empire had crumbled in record time. Investigations exposed offshore accounts, unpaid taxes, hidden scandals, and every dirty deal he had thought buried. Former allies testified against him. Veronica was seen on the arm of another wealthy man, and his fortune dwindled with every passing day. He poured himself another drink, but even the burn of alcohol no longer numbed the reality. Karma had stripped him of everything. And in the stillness, he thought of Evelyn, of the baby he had once mocked, calling him a mistake. He realized then that the true mistake had never been the child. It had been him, his arrogance, his blindness, his cruelty. He buried his face in his hands, but tears brought him no relief. Weeks passed, and Evelyn settled into her new rhythm as a mother. Though she lived modestly now, every smile from her son filled her with a wealth no money could buy. Offers poured in from organizations and women's groups who saw her as a symbol of courage, asking her to share her story, to inspire others who had suffered in silence. Though she was hesitant at first, Evelyn agreed, not out of pride, but out of a quiet desire to turn her pain into something meaningful. On small stages in community centers and later on televised interviews, she spoke, not with anger, but with calm conviction. She told her story not as a tale of revenge, but as a reminder that dignity must be defended, that silence in the face of cruelty is its own prison, and that no one should ever accept humiliation as their destiny. Every word she spoke resonated with people who needed to hear them, and Evelyn realized she had built something far greater than the life she once thought she needed. She had built a purpose. Daniel, meanwhile, was no longer the man the world once admired. Lawsuits drained him, bankruptcy loomed, and finally, a prison sentence awaited him for the financial crimes uncovered in the wake of his fall. The newspapers that once praised him now mocked his arrogance, branding him a fallen king, a cautionary tale of greed. On the day he was led away in handcuffs, cameras flashed, crowds jeered, and for the first time in his life, he was truly powerless. As he passed through the crowd, a reporter shouted Evelyn's name, asking if he had any message for the wife he had humiliated. Daniel's lips trembled, and though no one heard it clearly, those closest swore, he whispered, "I'm sorry." But apologies spoken too late are like ashes in the wind, empty, scattered, forgotten. Evelyn heard the news but felt no triumph, no satisfaction. She didn't smile at his downfall, because she had never needed his destruction to feel free. She simply held her son a little tighter that evening, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "We're safe now." That was all that mattered. The man who had once believed himself untouchable had been touched by karma in the harshest way, and Evelyn, who had once been humiliated and discarded, now stood unbroken, stronger than ever, her child cradled in her arms. Years later, when her son was old enough to ask about his father, Evelyn didn't tell him of cruelty, of betrayal, of humiliation. Instead, she told him the truth, but softened, shaped not to plant hatred in his heart, but wisdom. "Your father made choices that hurt people," she said gently, "but his mistakes are not yours to carry. What matters is that you grow to be kind, to be strong, to be honest. You are not his mistakes, you are my hope." Her son listened, his eyes wide, and hugged her, and Evelyn knew then that the cycle of cruelty had ended with her. She had broken it not with vengeance, but with love, and so the story closed where it had begun, not with wealth, not with power, not with humiliation, but with truth. Daniel had fallen, Evelyn had risen, and karma had written the ending no one could escape. For in the end, the mistress vanished, the empire collapsed, the crowd that once applauded Daniel forgot his name. But Evelyn's dignity remained, shining brighter than any jewel, stronger than any empire. She had walked through betrayal, carried the weight of humiliation, and still stood tall, proving to the world that sometimes the greatest revenge is not destruction, but survival, and that sometimes the truest victory is living well while those who sought to break you are left broken by their own hands.